My name is Eleanor Morrison, but everyone calls me Ellie. I'm 71 years old now, but there's one day from my childhood that feels like it happened yesterday, November 22nd, 1963. I was 10 years old sitting in Mrs. Henderson's 5th grade classroom in Dallas, Texas. And I need to tell you something that I've never told anyone outside my family. Something that's haunted me for 60 years. You see, that morning, my daddy almost took me to see the president's motorcade. We lived just a few blocks from Dealey Plaza. He'd promised me we could go, skip school for an hour, wave at President Kennedy as he drove by. But at the last minute, my mother said no. She said education was more important than parades. I was so angry at her, I didn't speak to her that whole morning. By lunchtime, I'd forgiven her. And that's when everything changed. It was a Friday, and everyone in Dallas was excited. The President and First Lady were visiting our city. You have to understand, in 1963, this was enormous. We didn't have internet or cable news. Seeing the President in person was something most people never got to do. That morning in school, we talked about it. Mrs. Henderson, our teacher, had written on the chalkboard, "President Kennedy visits Dallas today." She was young, maybe 25, and she loved the Kennedys. She had a picture of Jackie Kennedy cut out from a magazine taped to her desk. I remember what I was wearing. A blue dress with white collar that my grandmother had made for me, white ankle socks and Mary Jane shoes that pinched my toes. I had my hair in 2 braids tied with blue ribbons. I thought I looked so grown up. The morning went by normally. We practiced our multiplication tables. I got an A on my spelling test. The word I remember most was magnificent. I spelled it perfectly, and Mrs. Henderson drew a gold star next to it. During reading time, I was lost in a book about horses. I wanted a horse so badly. I'd asked for one for Christmas every year since I was 6. My parents kept saying we'd see, which I knew meant no. But I kept hoping. At 11:30 we lined up for lunch. The cafeteria smelled like meatloaf and green beans. I sat with my best friend Sarah Jean McClure. We were planning a sleepover for the next weekend. We were going to stay up all night and tell ghost stories. We thought we were so rebellious. Sarah Jean's mother had taken her little brother downtown to see the motorcade. Sarah Jean was jealous. I told her about how my mother wouldn't let me go and how unfair it was. We spent our whole lunch period complaining about our mothers and how they never let us do anything fun. I had no idea I'd spend the rest of my life thanking God for my mother's decision. We got back to class around 12:15. Mrs. Henderson had us take out our history books. We were studying the American Revolution. I remember thinking how boring it was to read about old dead presidents when a living president was driving through our city right at that moment. At 12:30, Mrs. Henderson was reading to us from the textbook. She was talking about George Washington crossing the Delaware. And then the classroom door opened. It was Mr. Pruitt, our principal. He was a tall man with grey hair and thick glasses. He always smiled, but that day his face was white, completely white, like he'd seen a ghost. He whispered something to Mrs. Henderson. I couldn't hear what he said, but I saw her hand go to her mouth. She made a sound, a little gasp. Then she said something I'll never forget. She said, "Children, I need you to put your heads down on your desks right now." We all looked at each other, confused. We only put our heads down when we were in trouble or during tornado drills. But we did what she said. Then Mr. Pruitt spoke. His voice was shaking. He said, "Children, something very serious has happened. President Kennedy has been shot. We don't know anything else yet, but we need everyone to stay calm and pray." I remember lifting my head up. I wasn't supposed to, but I did. I saw Mrs. Henderson crying, actually crying, tears running down her face, and suddenly I couldn't breathe. Shot. The president had been shot in my city, maybe just a few blocks away from where I was sitting. And then I thought about my daddy. He was downtown. He worked at a bank on Main Street. The motorcade was going down Main Street. I started crying. I couldn't help it. Other kids were crying too. Some of them didn't really understand what was happening, but they were scared because the adults were scared. Mrs. Henderson tried to compose herself. She told us to bow our heads and pray. So we did. 23 10-year-olds, heads bowed, praying for a man we'd only seen in newspapers and on television. I prayed for the president. I prayed for Mrs. Kennedy. And I prayed that my daddy was safe. Time moved strangely after that. I don't know how long we sat there. It felt like hours, but it was probably only 20 minutes. Then Mr. Pruitt came back. His face was even whiter than before. He didn't say anything. He just nodded at Mrs. Henderson, and she told us, "The president is dead." I don't remember much about the next few hours. It's like my brain shut down. I remember bits and pieces, like scenes from a movie that's been edited wrong. I remember the school secretary coming to get me and 3 other kids whose parents worked downtown. She took us to the office. We sat in plastic chairs and waited. I remember a radio playing, a man's voice saying the same things over and over. President Kennedy was dead, shot in Dealey Plaza. Governor Connolly was wounded. A suspect was in custody. I remember my mother arriving. She was crying so hard she could barely stand. She grabbed me and held me so tight I thought my ribs would break. She kept saying, "Thank God, thank God, thank God." My daddy came home an hour later. He'd been 4 blocks away when it happened. He heard the shots. He said the whole city just stopped. Like time froze. People were screaming and running and crying. He'd walked home because all the traffic was stopped. That night, we sat in our living room and watched the news on our black and white television. Walter Cronkite took off his glasses and told America that our president was dead. My mother cried. My daddy cried. I'd never seen my daddy cry before. They showed footage of Mrs. Kennedy in her pink suit covered in blood. They showed the motorcade. They showed Dealey Plaza, where I could have been standing if my mother had said yes. My mother held my hand all night. She didn't say it, but I knew what she was thinking. That could have been me. I could have been there. I could have seen it happen. I could have been hurt. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mrs. Henderson's face when Mr. Pruitt told her. I heard Mr. Pruitt's shaking voice saying, "Shot." I saw my daddy's face when he came home. The next day, Saturday, we stayed home. The whole city stayed home. It felt like the whole country held its breath. On Sunday, we were watching television again when they showed Lee Harvey Oswald being transferred, and then live on television we watched Jack Ruby shoot him. My mother turned off the TV immediately, but I'd already seen it. In 3 days, I'd learned that presidents could be murdered, that violence could happen anywhere, that the world wasn't as safe as I thought it was. Monday was the funeral. Schools were closed. Everything was closed. We watched President Kennedy's funeral on television. I remember little John saluting his father's casket. He was only 3 years old. I was 10, and I couldn't comprehend what had happened. How could a 3-year-old? The weeks after were strange. Dallas became the city where Kennedy died. People around the country blamed us. They said Dallas killed Kennedy. They said we were a city of hate. At school, some of the kids stopped talking about it. They wanted to forget, but I couldn't forget. None of us really could. Mrs. Henderson was never the same. She finished out that school year, but she was quieter, sadder. The picture of Jackie Kennedy came down from her desk. The next year we heard she'd moved to California. I always wondered if she left because of that day. Sarah Jean and I stayed best friends through high school, but we never talked about November 22nd. It was like an unspoken agreement. That day was too big, too painful. For years I had nightmares. I dreamed that I was at Dealey Plaza, that I'd convinced my mother to let me go. In the dreams I'd see terrible things. I'd wake up screaming. When I got older, I felt guilty. Guilty that I'd been angry at my mother that morning. Guilty that I'd wanted to go downtown. Guilty that I'd spent lunch complaining about not getting to see the motorcade. Guilty that my biggest worry that morning was whether I'd get a horse for Christmas. I carried that guilt for years, through high school, through college, into my 20s. It wasn't until I had my own daughter that I really understood. Her name is Caroline, named after Caroline Kennedy. When Caroline was 10, the same age I was that day, I looked at her and suddenly understood what my mother must have felt. That moment of saying no to me that morning, that moment that saved me from being at Dealey Plaza. That was a mother's instinct. She didn't know what would happen. She couldn't have known. But something in her said, keep your daughter close today. And I realized that I'd spent 30 years being grateful to my mother for saving me, but also carrying guilt about wanting to be there. The guilt didn't make sense, but feelings rarely do. Now, here's the part I've never told anyone except my husband and my daughter, the part that's haunted me for 60 years. A few weeks after the assassination, my daddy came home from work early one day. He sat me down at the kitchen table. He looked serious, the way he did when I was in trouble. He told me that he'd been at his bank that morning, November 22nd. He'd gone outside to watch the motorcade pass. He'd been standing on Main Street with hundreds of other people waving and cheering as the president drove by. Then he told me something he hadn't told my mother, something he'd kept secret because he didn't want to scare us more than we already were. He said that after the motorcade passed, he'd felt something, an urge, a pull. He'd almost followed the motorcade, almost walked down to Dealey Plaza to watch them turn onto Elm Street. His bank was so close, it would have taken 5 minutes. But then he'd looked at his watch and realized he had a meeting. An important client was coming in. So he'd gone back inside. If that client had been 5 minutes late, my daddy would have been in Dealey Plaza. He would have been standing there when the shots were fired. Then he looked at me and said something I'll never forget. He said, "Ellie, that morning when your mama said you couldn't come downtown, I was angry at her too. I thought she was being too strict, but the same instinct that kept you safe kept me from walking to Dealey Plaza. Sometimes we're protected in ways we don't understand." He told me this because he wanted me to stop feeling guilty. He knew somehow, without me saying it, that I felt guilty about wanting to be there. He wanted me to know that he'd wanted to be there too, in the worst place at the worst time, and we'd both been saved by small decisions. A spelling test that kept me focused on school, a client meeting that kept him at his desk, a mother's firm, no. These tiny things that seemed insignificant changed everything. I'm 71 years old now. President Kennedy has been gone longer than he was alive. Most people alive today weren't born when he died. But I was there, not at Dealey Plaza, but in Dallas, in that classroom, in that moment when everything changed. I've thought about that day thousands of times over the years. I've visited the 6th floor museum. I've stood in Dealey Plaza. I've tried to understand how something so terrible could happen in my city, in my America. And here's what I've learned, what I want to tell you, especially if you're young and listening to this. First, tragedy doesn't ask permission. It doesn't wait for a convenient time. November 22nd started as a normal Friday. By afternoon, nothing was normal again. The world can change in seconds. So live your life fully. Don't wait for the perfect moment. Tell people you love them. Make the memories. Take the chances that matter. Second, sometimes the disappointments in life are actually blessings. I was so angry that morning that I couldn't go downtown. It felt like the end of the world to my 10-year-old self. But my mother's no kept me safe. Not every no is a punishment. Sometimes no is protection. Sometimes what feels like a closed door is actually a shield. Third, guilt about things you couldn't control will eat you alive if you let it. For 30 years I felt guilty about wanting to be at Dealey Plaza, but I was 10. I didn't know what would happen. None of us did. If you're carrying guilt about something you couldn't have known, couldn't have prevented, couldn't have changed, please let it go. Forgive yourself. You deserve that. Fourth, small moments matter more than we realize. A mother saying no, a meeting scheduled at the right time, a spelling test that kept a girl focused on school instead of watching out the window. These moments seem insignificant, but they ripple out in ways we can't predict. Be present in the small moments. They might be the ones that save you. And finally, this is the most important thing. When something terrible happens, when tragedy strikes, when the world feels dark and dangerous, look for the people who hold you. My mother held my hand all night. My daddy told me his secret to ease my guilt. My husband listened to this story 50 times over 50 years of marriage. My daughter Caroline, named after a little girl who lost her father, became a teacher like Mrs. Henderson. We survive the worst days because of the people who love us. We heal because someone holds our hand in the dark. We find meaning because we share our stories, even the painful ones, especially the painful ones. That 10-year-old girl in the blue dress with the braids and the pinching shoes, she grew up. She had a good life. She married a wonderful man. She raised a beautiful daughter. She became a teacher like Mrs. Henderson because she wanted to be there for children on their worst days, the way Mrs. Henderson tried to be there for us. But that little girl is still inside me. She always will be. She still remembers the sound of Mr. Pruitt's shaking voice. She still sees Mrs. Henderson's tears. She still feels her mother's desperate hug. And she wants you to know that even after the darkest days, even after your whole world changes in an instant, even after you're sure nothing will ever be okay again, somehow life goes on. Somehow you find joy again. You laugh again. You love again. The grief never completely goes away. November 22nd comes around every year, and I'm always quiet on that day. I always think about Mrs. Henderson, about Sarah Jean, about my daddy standing on Main Street, about the daughter I named Caroline, about John saluting a flag-draped casket. But I also think about my mother's wisdom, my daddy's secret, the small moments that saved us, the love that held us together, the life that went on, that had to go on, that was worth living even after everything changed. If you're listening to this and you've lived through your own November 22nd, your own day that changed everything, I want you to know something. You will survive it. You will carry it with you, yes, but it won't destroy you. You'll find meaning in it somehow. You'll learn lessons you wish you didn't have to learn. You'll become stronger in places where you broke. And someday, maybe 60 years from now, you'll sit in a chair like this one and tell your story. And someone will listen, and your pain will have purpose. Your survival will mean something. Your life will be proof that even the worst days don't get the final word. That's what I've learned. That's what a 10-year-old girl in Dallas, Texas discovered over 7 decades of living. That's what I want to pass on to you. Thank you for listening to an old woman's memories. Thank you for letting me share this weight I've carried. Thank you for caring about a day that happened so long ago. And please, please, if you take anything from my story, take this. Hold the people you love a little tighter tonight. Tell them what they mean to you. Don't wait, because the world can change in seconds, but love, real love, that lasts forever. God bless you, and God bless America.